never talk about, but should more often, children's books. Not the ones we read on our parents' laps back when we were too young to sit on toilets, but the ones that sneaked up on us in middle age and clocked us between the eyes. Ever had that experience? No? Then you don't read enough children's books, my friend. Especially the good ones, the ones that matter, the ones written by folks who know how to tell stories and really get what's going on in this place. If you haven't figured it out yet, that's the next esoteric item up for bids on today's Informational Price is Right. I want to tell you about a children's book, but not just any children's book, rather the only one I've read in the past 40 years that deserves to be mentioned in the same breath as Stan the Hot Dog Man. Another classic I'm sure I'll give its due in a future Walkcast. Anywho, this book did something to me. Got under my skin and made me weep like a baby when I first read it. Then continued to get under my skin until I finally sat up and took notice. Took it as the Godsmack upside my head that it was, and let it transform my thinking in no small way. Again, not back when I was wearing towels as capes and jumping naked off the backs of couches to scare my teenage sisters, but just 10 years ago, when I was on the verge of a complete emotional and spiritual meltdown and wondering how I was going to take another step, let alone face another day. What book was this, you ask? Well, let's finish Mike Yolch's excellent blues riff from That's Just How I Roll, make like Jimmy Morrison and break on through to the other side of my rudimentary glitching Walkcast logo, and we'll talk about it. At which point you'll find yourself wondering once again just how you wandered into this strange land of the preternatural, sucked into yet another Walkcast like a piece of pocket lint into a mealy. I'm Doug, by the way, and I'm absolutely thrilled you made it this far. Here's hoping I'll see you on the other side.
But you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, how you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.
January 29th, 1964 was a significant day in the life of a man named William Bartlett Peet. Because that's when the celebrated storyboard editor and animator walked away from his job after a heated argument with his boss, Walt Disney, over the direction of a new feature they'd been working on called The Jungle Book. It was Bill Peet's 49th birthday, and he'd had enough of Uncle Walt's mercurial temperament, abrupt bedside manner, OCDS micromanagement, and complete lack of gratitude. So like Springsteen and Hungry Heart, he walked across a parking lot in Anaheim Jack, got in a car, and never went back. He essentially hit a proverbial wall, snapped. And like so many of us approaching the half-century mark of our lives, he closed a chapter of the most prolific time period of his 50-year existence as an artist, probably wondering, also like us, if this was the end of things for him. If he'd just watch his best years fade in the rear view as he drove away. If he'd ever do anything as meaningful and fulfilling in his life again before going quietly into that good night. Well, and not so ironically, this was sort of my story too. Although I'd hit my proverbial wall a few years sooner than 49. For me, the beginning of my back nine slide wasn't nearly as dramatic or publicized as a run-in with the billionaire CEO of one of the biggest entertainment brands in the world over creative differences. But it was significant enough, and I recall it all too well. I totally get what Pete must have been feeling. That painful gnaw in the thick of your gut at how quickly things can change. And how we can go from feeling invincible as human beings one second to being completely and utterly broken the next. From soaring eagles to ground moles on a dime, just like that. In my specific case, the before picture looked like this. Pacing back and forth in front of English classes at 2 separate high schools and 5 separate universities over the course of 25 years. Arms waving, spit flying, voice booming, and young charges eating out of the proverbial palm of my hand. I was on educational speed back in those days. Robin Williams doing 180 days of endless stand-up. And I was in stride, brother, at the top of my game. Rattling off pages of info without even thinking or consulting a note card. I was young, the spotlight felt good, and the words came freely. Couldn't get them out fast enough. In fact, at one point, I wondered if it was possible that I could get any better at what I did. Well, fast forward to summer 2008, when I'm standing there in room 101 at the now defunct Pickerington Center of Ohio University, sleepwalking through the same 308J lecture I'd given literally 100 times before over the course of a decade. I've actually counted. Anyway, I'm right in the middle of my spiel on the value of pre-writing, right at the point where I usually dazzle the students with my brilliant mud ball analogy, basking in the glow of the perfect illustration I just sketched on the dry erase board to underscore my point. When I wheeled around mid-sentence, expo marker raised slightly in my right hand, and it happened. got caught in the beam of the projector, precisely the wrong spot and precisely the wrong second. And it jarred me out of my little self-induced land of make-believe. And something just snapped. In me, that is. Completely blanked. Totally forgot what I was saying, where I was, even what I was supposed to be doing. Now, if you're a teacher, you know that we're not immune to this. And it's not like it hadn't happened to me enough times before. It had. I'd had more than my share of brain fart moments throughout my career when I'd lose track of where I was and what I'd been saying. But the thing is, I'd always snap out of it, kick back into gear, and carry on, not missing a beat. But this time was different. Not only did I blank, but I felt something happen that was new. My brain locked, my hands shook, and I suddenly felt, well, powerless. I scrambled for words, tried to pick up a thread of thought, but I came up empty. Best I could manage was to fake a cough and dismiss the class for a break, which I'm sure they found odd given that I'd just given them a break 10 minutes earlier. And dude, I won't forget that day anytime soon. Won't forget standing there in the men's restroom during that break I'd given the class, arms braced against the sides of the sink, gazing at my haunted expression in the mirror, thinking, my God, what just happened? I can't go back in there. I'll completely lose it. I mean, it was easily one of the most genuinely terrifying moments of my life. And it broke me. I mean, wow, the fallout. I suddenly dreaded speaking in public, and in a mad scramble to keep my life from falling apart, I had to retool all my classes to essentially remove myself from the spotlight, turning all my lectures into Blackboard and YouTube videos that students could access on their own at their own pace via their laptops or lab computers, while I played to my strength in conference with students who needed help. In short, for an entire year, I was unable to stand in front of a classroom again and give a formal lecture. It's as though God had struck me dumb, taking away from me the ability to do the only thing I knew how to do up to that point, lecture. Okay, enough of that. Back to Bill Peet.
And you don't stand an outside chance. Don't stand an outside chance, but you can try.
After his blow up with Disney and leaving behind his lucrative career as one of the studio's go-to animators, Pete was forced to have to shift gears. But the good news is that in his last few years, while still working for Uncle Walt, he'd actually managed to publish a few children's books on the side that were well received. So he threw caution to the wind and decided that he was going to move forward in this direction exclusively. And he did. Beginning in 1964 with Ella, Pete would rattle off a string of 30 more children's books to add to the 5 that he'd already written and had published while he was still working for Disney. And they weren't just fillers. During his total run from 1959 all the way up until his final book in 1990, Cockadoodle Dudley, which, by the way, he wrote and illustrated when he was 75, Pete had walked home with no fewer than 16 national and state awards for his work, merely confirming the fact that during his 55-year run, he was probably considered the children's writer by parents, teachers, and librarians all over the country. But it wasn't until 2007 when I discovered him. When 2 years after my second son, Jake, was born, I happened upon a used paperback copy of Fly Homer Fly at Half-Price Books and took a chance, which ended up being the watershed moment for my family's nearly decade involvement with the author. Thing is, my sons were spellbound by Fly Homer Fly, and I think I must have read that book over and over to them at least a dozen times before Deb and I finally caved, went back to Half-Price Books and cleaned the shelf of every other Pete title they had. Which brings us back to the summer of 2008, otherwise known as the summer I turned pretty. Pretty frazzled and terrified, that is. Well, even though I'd made the necessary logistical adjustments to keep my job, I was still reeling by fall semester 2 months after my debacle, in the throes of one of the most significant wrestling matches I've ever had with God. I was Lieutenant Dan tied to the mast of the shrimp boat during the raging storm in Forrest Gump, shaking my fist and yelling at the night sky,
It's time for a showdown! You and me! I'm right here!
and that's where I was when I had Jack and Jake hop up on my lap one night, and I yanked the next title from my Pete stash, which happened to be this little number, Encore for Eleanor. And it's funny, Pete himself claims that Chester the Worldly Pig was his most autobiographical book, but I contend that he said that because at that point in his autobiography, which pretty much ends in 1954, he hadn't written Encore yet. But we'll save that for another Walkcast. Right now, I'd like you to pause this video and go read the book if you haven't already done so. Thing is, I can't read the story to you here because of copyright restrictions. So if you want to track with the remainder of this podcast, you'll need to check the book out of your local library or grab a used copy off of Amazon or find a PDF copy online somewhere, which is unfortunate, I know, because Encore isn't an easy title to find. And I am sorry about that. But I do hope you put the book on your radar because it'll easily be the best 9 minutes you'll spend doing anything this week, or the most important. So be gone with you. Read. And then let's see if the divine really can speak to discouraged middle-aged folks like us through a lowly children's book. Yeah, I should just end my Walkcast right here. Don't even need to explain it, do I? Only to say that by the time I'd read that last page to my sons initially, I was a hot mess. Tears streaking my face and snot bubbling from my nose while Jack and Jake alternated awkward glances at me, probably wondering if I'd been nursing a hemorrhoid or something. Because after all, how could a children's book possibly do this? I mean, it was about an elephant who draws stuff, for crying out loud. How could it make a grown man cry? But the honest to goodness truth is that it did. Probably, I'm guessing, because I border manic depression and have a boatload of repressed trauma buried deep in my psyche from when I was a kid. But I think it's more than that. I do. There was something brutally simple, honest, pure, and authentically transparent about the story, especially its ending. And I think Bill Peet felt it too as he was writing it, because the last 5 pages were so moving and fraught with truth that I can't imagine someone's having written and illustrated them without completely losing it. I mean, they had everything. But before we talk about that, let's go back and make sure that we covered the obvious. I mean, you get the metaphor, right? Elite circus performer with a spectacular act wows the masses for 40 years until, of course, time takes its toll and makes the performer a little less agile, a little less strong, and a little less sure of herself, to the point where she finally ends up having a moment that brings her entire 4-decade career toppling to the big top dirt floor, in this case, literally. Hers, a fall from stilts. Mine, which I've already said, a good old-fashioned deer in the headlights brain fart during a lecture. At any rate, Eleanor's moment initiates the beginning of the end of her idyllic and charmed life as she knew it. And whether or not we want to see old Colonel T.J. Tingelhofer's character as literal or figurative, Eleanor finds herself effecting an embarrassed exit from the very environment that had provided her with her livelihood for so many glorious years. And what happens to her? Well, initially, there's a sheer terror of the unknown. As en route to her new destination past the dreary factory buildings of the big city, she runs through a laundry list of all the ways her life can possibly go south, most of them having to do with the physical. As she mistakenly reasons that because her debacle at the circus involved a literal failure of her body, she's doomed to a slow and horrifically painful corporeal demise. This is a beautiful part of the book, by the way. The way Peet effectively captures the elephant's snowballing angst and suffocating claustrophobia through a series of illustrations that move Eleanor from the blue sky and bright, colorful open spaces of the circus, past the heavy lines and muted colors of massive brick industrial buildings with their imposing stacks belching smoke into a foreboding sky, and finally to the structured order of the city zoo, with its multiple fenced-in enclosures that collectively amount to little more than an assisted living facility for animals. The progression is beautiful because it metaphorically walks us through the emotional stages that can follow a traumatic event or nervous breakdown, beginning with initial shock, followed by a very real, palpable fear, which can lead to depression, and ultimately ending with a tempered resignation and reluctant acceptance, often accompanied by self-imposed isolation or the erecting of protective walls. And that's exactly what happens to Eleanor. For years, even though it's within the safe and somewhat predictable confines of the big top tent, she obliviously perceives herself footloose and fancy-free at the circus. That is, until she's bitten by the proverbial black dog of reality, as it were. In this case, an unexpected trauma, which in turn introduces a heretofore unexperienced feeling of doubt that drives her to a moment of crisis, suddenly making her aware of the tenuous reality of her situation and bringing her face to face with her limitations and worst fears. This, in turn, humbles her with the realization of her smallness, her weakness, her mortality, which finally drives her into what appears to be a forced but is really self-imposed exile, where she embraces the safety of isolation to protect herself from further possible injury, content merely to live out her final days being invisible, so as not to risk another debilitating emotional relapse leading to further humiliation. This is where we find our pachyderm protagonist on page 15, when Peet decides to do something truly miraculous with the last 23 pages of his book. Arguably the greatest short story writer of the 20th century, Flannery O'Connor once said that there's a moment in every great story in which the presence of grace can be felt as it waits to be accepted or rejected, even though the reader may not recognize this moment. Well, I'd argue that this is what makes Bill Pete's encore for Eleanor such a great story. It's the truly miraculous something I just alluded to, the palpable looming of grace that Pete unfolds over the last 24 pages of his book. The small miracle that, as with the inauspicious arrival of Christ, doesn't begin to great fanfare or thunderous applause under a big top tenor on a massive stage. Rather, it starts here, the way most miracles do, with Eleanor's visible backside peering out from the darkened doorway of an old barn. With the elephants staying out of sight as best she could by hiding all through the day until the zoo was closed, after which she'd sneak out for evening meal, but only when she was sure no one was around. Pete calls her life during this time lonely and miserable. And he says that she would have gone on being miserable if someone hadn't happened along to change her dreary routine. In this case, a teenage girl who Pete says has come to the zoo to sketch the animals. This is a pivotal moment in the book, one that I think is bound to go overlooked by most reading the story. But to me, it's amazing, and it screams to be examined further for three very glaring reasons. One, of all the places to set up shop, the girl chooses the sidewalk just outside the fence next to Eleanor's barn door. Okay. Two, she makes such a racket setting up something as simple as an easel that she awakens Eleanor from an afternoon nap. And finally, and I think most importantly, the activity she happens to be engaging in is the art of charcoal sketching. Why is this significant? Well, because of the last line on page 17, when the narrator tells us that Eleanor had often wondered how people drew pictures, and this was her chance to find out. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm prompted to ask, who is this girl anyway? And is it really by sheer happenstance that she ends up exactly where she is at precisely this moment doing something that has arrested Eleanor's attention for, I don't know, maybe years? Yeah, you can say what you want, but I don't see this as plain average, everyday, ordinary coincidence. I see this as something much more deliberate, premeditated, dare I say, appointed by force or forces divine. Why? Well, it's the sequence of events that happens next on pages 18 through 24, which seals it for me. Because the girl's specific actions are too extraordinary to write off as superfluous or random. First, she positions herself right where Eleanor has a clear view of her sketch pad. Second, she doesn't stir when Eleanor creeps across the pen to the fence behind her, peeking over her shoulder. And third, the girl doesn't just start scratching a rough sketch of the rhinoceros in the pen across the way. She settles in, takes her time, pausing every now and then to study the rhino and figure out where to put all the creases and folds in his leathery hide. What I'm saying is that at least while the rhino cooperated by not moving, the girl took painstaking care to make her drawing as lifelike as possible, right down to the smallest detail. The idea here is that significant time has passed since the girl started her drawing. And Eleanor has had the best seat in the house to observe an inspired artist as she creates. And her sense of wonder is so stirred by the experience that when the rhino finally flops to the ground and the girl, with an angry shrug, tosses her charcoal onto the sidewalk, crumples up her drawing, flings it into a trash can, and wanders away to a shady knoll overlooking a lily pond to watch the ducks and swans, Eleanor is spurred into action, inspired to create in spite of herself, in spite of her situation. Okay, we need to stop here, I think, and take a good look at just what this innocent little teenage girl's done. She set into motion, I think deliberately so, a series of events that she has to know will goad the elephant to action. First, she patiently conducts a clinic on how to sketch a subject with charcoal, no doubt answering all the significant questions Eleanor's had in mind about the medium. Second, when she throws her little tantrum that seems a little too theatrical and a little too out of character for her, notice how she quietly makes off with the lily pond, inexplicably leaving her easel and a piece of charcoal on the sidewalk back at the fence just within reach of Eleanor's trunk, with a brand new sheet of paper poised and ready to go, no less. And when Eleanor ends up taking the bait, in a flash of inspiration, seizing the charcoal in her trunk and dashing off a quick likeness of Zonko the clown, who miraculously is right there the second she finishes, having given Eleanor exactly as much time as she needed to put a few ruffles on the floppy clown collar and finish her sketch. Well, our girl, that's who. And what does she do? Does she gawk in disbelief and then faint as any self-respecting teenage girl would likely have done upon returning to collect her art equipment and finding such a marvel as a sketch of a clown drawn by an elephant? No, she doesn't. Rather, she marvels at the drawing, immediately waving it in the air and shouting at the top of her voice for anyone with an earshot to come see what the elephant drew. It's here that she tips her hand and gives herself away. It's as though she's wholly expected to find this drawing upon her return and is more relieved than surprised that it's there, as though she's been waiting for it, which seems to imply that our little episode of the sketching elephant might have been as random an occurrence as one might initially think. That forces greater than the elephant herself were behind the scenes, nudging Eleanor, cheering her on. We have an expression for this in Christian circles, and you're going to dismiss me the second I say it. It's called the prompting of the Holy Spirit. And indeed, it doesn't seem like such a stretch, at least to me, to suggest that divine forces are clearly at work in transforming and reshaping our beloved pachyderm and bringing her back from the dead, so to speak. And what a sight it is to watch Eleanor flourish, even in spite of the enemy's best efforts to roar about like a lion and rob her of her joy, as we see in Pete's thinly veiled Walt Disney-esque depiction of Mr. McJunkins in the book's climax. The man who, as Disney did frequently with Pete throughout the latter's career, bounds onto the scene to squelch Eleanor's big moment with the school kids and their teacher by saying, "I hate to spoil your fun, but I'm afraid it is altogether impossible for an elephant to draw a picture. Even though Eleanor was once a clever circus performer, she is after all nothing more than a dumb animal." Ouch. This moment has the potential to be brutal for Eleanor, as I'm sure it was for Bill Pete throughout most of his career working for Uncle Walt, as evidenced by the number of times the former recast the latter in his stories, nearly always as an oppressive force of opposition for his main characters to overcome en route to triumph or redemption. Here, McJunkins serves as a clear metaphor for all the naysayers who stand in opposition to any beleaguered person's attempt to pick up pieces, shift gears, try something entirely new, or step outside of his comfort zone. He's that guy who always feels compelled to be a fly in the ointment, as John McClane put it in Die Hard, who always seems compelled to make damn sure that we don't put ourselves out there in this life, that we don't do something stupid like try to make ourselves useful, encourage people, or actually enjoy living. And this brings us to my absolute favorite part of the book, the part that makes my soul stand on tiptoes, the late Mike Yaconelli once put it, the part that opened the floodgates for me when I first read it, the part that gave me a glimpse of the way God sees me. It's on back-to-back two-page sequences from pages 32 through 35, and it happens immediately when McJunkins shows up to call Eleanor a dumb animal and say she has no business drawing anything. Here, let's look at it again. And when we do, I want you to note where each character is standing, as well as a look on each of their faces in each of the sequences, essentially treating them as before and after frames. "I hate to spoil your fun," he said, "but I'm afraid it is altogether impossible for an elephant to draw a picture. Even though Eleanor was once a clever circus performer, she is after all nothing more than a dumb animal." No one likes to be called dumb, especially a super intelligent elephant like Eleanor. And she was furious. "A dumb animal, am I?" she grumbled into her trunk. "I'll show that uppity fellow a thing or two. Oh, indeed I will." Once again, Eleanor gripped the charcoal in her trunk, and as everyone watched in amazement, the riled-up elephant dashed off a portrait of a lion. It was old Maynard, another familiar face from the circus. Scraggly mane, mournful eyes, whiskers and all. And she finished the sketch in only 17 seconds. Stupendous, stammered Mr. McJunkins. "Fantastic! Eleanor's a super sensational elephant. If she can draw a clown and a lion, she can draw lots of things. What do you say we put on an elephant drawing show?" "Terrific idea," everyone happily agreed. And of course, Eleanor was overjoyed at the chance to be a star performer once more. A few things to note here. One, the joy on the teenage girl's face when Eleanor follows through and does what the girl's wanting her to do. She's elated. I'm sure it's how God feels when he prompts us with his Holy Spirit to step out of our comfort zone and respond to his leading. And two, and perhaps more importantly, note both the reaction and facial expression of Eleanor's biggest detractor, Mr. McJunkins. He's as moved as everyone else by what's just happened. And in a smaller way, but no less significant than Eleanor's, he's redeemed as well. This is the absolute brilliance and miracle of Jesus when he shows up wherever he does. He's not about vengeance. He doesn't help the struggling Christian get even with his adversaries, making sure they get the comeuppance they so richly deserve. He wins them over. He elevates everyone, eradicates anything resembling guilt and judgment, to the point where the only soul who's left tormented by Eleanor's courage and bravery is the one that doesn't take on human form and isn't anywhere present in this scene to think of. Go ahead. I'll wait. Look for him. I'm talking about Old Scratch, the evil one, or any of his minions. Fact is, you won't find him or them. He's not there. He can't be. It's impossible for evil to withstand the light of Christ's presence, to be anywhere near it, let alone marvel over it. With one stroke of the piece of charcoal in her trunk, Eleanor, empowered by the Holy Spirit, returns the ordinary to the sacred, and in doing so reclaims a little lost part of herself. Note that when McJunkins initially berates her, Eleanor is furious and riled up. But does she reach across the sidewalk and wrap her trunk around the zoo director and squeeze the living Beetlejuice out of him? Does she take the piece of charcoal and jam it down his throat? Does she snatch him up and bounce him 5 times off the sidewalk until he's senseless? No, she doesn't. She responds to the Holy Spirit's prompting in the way that we all should, peacefully and confidently extending her trunk to do the one and only thing that she knows can possibly make all things right with the world and bring about an outcome where everyone wins. She silences her critics with proof of God's divine hand at work in her. And her obedience to the Lord's prompting is what initiates the real change.
You showed me how to do exactly what you do, how I fell in love with you.
And the rest, as they say, is history. Our fallen, washed-up, angst-riddled Eleanor gets reinvented, finds a new purpose for being, a new way of utilizing her skill set. And although this new application of her talent is far removed from the cheering crowds, bright lights, and nonstop excitement of her former life under the big top, it's not without its sense of fulfillment and or excitement. After all, as the narrator concludes on the final page, Eleanor's drawings could never be considered great art. Yet as far as anyone knew, they were the best drawings ever made by an elephant. But for all the kids could see, they were plenty good and even super terrific. And at the end of every performance, the children were always calling for more, all of which was sweet music to the happy old elephant's big flappy ears.
Do you know what I mean? Can't you read in between the lines? Sometimes I'm talking and it doesn't seem too clear.
Okay, so what does all this mean for me, for you? I mean, it's great that a children's book could move me to tears and all, but so what? Why devote an entire Walkcast to a children's book writer from yesteryear and one of his lesser-known books at that? Well, to me, it's simple, really. Eleanor's fate will one day be the fate of all of us. And for some, the topple from stilts to the big top floor will come sooner rather than later. But rest assured, brothers and sisters, it will come. And when it does, it will be a dark and lonely time for all of us, no one excepted. A terrifying crawl through a thick and impassable tangle of anxiety and confusion that will make us question everything about our time and place in this time and place. For some, like me, it might come mid-sentence while delivering a lecture you've given 100 times. For others, it might come in a doctor's office immediately following the worst possible test result or diagnosis you could possibly receive. For others still, it might come just seconds after the crunch of steel against steel on I-70, as your RAV4, Harley-Davidson, or electric bicycle rolls down the pavement, slamming into an embankment, leaving you with no feeling whatsoever from the neck or waist down. And I guess this is the question of the day. What then? What do we do when the bottom falls out? Do we throw in the proverbial towel, park ourselves in the nearest old barn with our asses facing the doorway, and disappear for what's left of our wasted, ruined lives? Or do we keep our eyes and ears open? And like I just quoted from dear old departed Mike Yaconelli a few seconds ago, make our souls stand on tiptoe, waiting with a rabid eagerness to see what the divine has waiting for us behind door number 2, especially when we're no longer able, for whatever reason, to enjoy what we once found behind door number 1. And then the follow-up question. When our nameless, faceless girl comes, and she will come, bearing her charcoal and easel and setting up shop right outside our fence or barn door, will we embrace the moment and throw ourselves into it, picking up the girl's errant charcoal and sketching our clown in spite of the Mr. McJunkinses who will always be right there to tell us we can't and shouldn't? These are the real questions in life, my friend, and only you can answer them. For me, this podcast is my picking up that charcoal after my fall from stilts and 2 years in the barn. This is scary as hell to me, and I have no business doing it, as I've been told by my share of Mr. McJunkinses. But like Eleanor with her charcoal and canvas, this bee is in my bonnet, for better or for worse. And I have one of 2 choices to make. And I choose the one Martin Luther once did, the one that's immortalized in one of his most famous quotes, that even if I knew that tomorrow the world would still go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree. Thanks, Eleanor, Bill Pete, for that reminder at a time when I really needed it.